I found my own initials carved into a cave wall 3 miles underground, but I'd never been there before. At 3 a.m. that same year, a security guard named Maya Torres heard her own voice calling from the hallway of an abandoned psychiatric ward, and when she checked the security camera, she saw herself standing outside the locked door, but she was inside the room. Then there was Derek Vaughn, an experienced caver in West Virginia whose rope snapped at 200 feet down, and as his headlamp flickered out, he realized the handprints on the cave wall were fresh and leading deeper into the darkness. These are two disturbing events from 2019 and 2021 that still don't have explanations. And the first happened to Maya Torres at a shuttered hospital in Pennsylvania on what started as an ordinary Tuesday night shift. But what happened next changed everything. Story 1. The double shift. Maya Torres was locked inside patient room 237 at 3:47 a.m. when she heard her own voice screaming from the hallway, begging someone to let her out. And when she looked up at the small monitor bolted to the corner of the ceiling, she saw herself on the grainy black and white feed standing outside the door, pounding on it with bloody hands, even though she hadn't moved from the bed and could still feel the cold metal restraint ring under her fingers, and the red digits on the wall clock said 3:47 a.m. and had said 3:47 for what felt like forever. But what happened next made her realize time wasn't the only thing that had stopped making sense in Ward 7 of Westfield Psychiatric Hospital that night. 3 weeks earlier, the job had sounded boring in the best possible way. Night security in the abandoned East Wing of a state hospital in Pennsylvania, 8-hour shifts every Tuesday and Thursday, one person per wing to save money. Walk the perimeter, log each floor, and make sure no scrap thieves or ghost-hunting teenagers slipped in through the plywood-covered windows. Human Resources had downplayed the building's history with a single line. Ward 7 was closed in 2004 after a fire, and she hadn't bothered to dig further because the pay finally meant her mother's overdue medication could be covered and the eviction notices might stop piling up under the apartment door. During her training week, she'd shadowed a day guard who rolled his eyes at the ghost stories, saying the only scary thing in the building was the asbestos. But the older night nurse in the active wing, a woman named Eileen, had pulled Maya aside when they were alone and said, "Don't let them put you on the East Wing past midnight for more than a couple of weeks, honey. That place remembers people and sometimes it doesn't like letting go." Then laughed it off like a joke when her supervisor walked in, and Maya had filed it away in that mental drawer labeled local superstition. Her first few shifts passed like that drawer, closed and mostly ignored. She did the rounds, checked that the boarded windows stayed boarded, chased off exactly one high school couple trying to sneak in for a dare, and learned the particular sounds of an old hospital at night. The hum of oxygen machines from the active wings bleeding faintly through the walls, the occasional distant code call over the main PA, the clank and sigh of pipes as hot water moved through rusted arteries. The abandoned Ward 7 was worse by day than by night. Harsh sunlight made the peeling paint, scorch marks from the fire, and lingering graffiti painfully obvious. In the dark, it all blurred into gray shapes and straight lines. Still, little things began to nag at her by the end of the second week. On one Thursday shift, she found the fire door at the far end of Ward 7 propped open an inch by a folded cardboard wedge, even though she knew she'd checked it an hour before and seen it closed. When she kicked the wedge away and picked it up, she found someone had written 3:47 on it in black ballpoint pen, then gone over the numbers again and again until they almost broke through the cardboard. On another night, she passed the glass observation window in 231 and had to backtrack because, in the corner of her eye, she'd glimpsed a pale shape near the bed. When she shined her flashlight in, the room was empty except for an old restraint strap dangling from the frame, swaying as if someone had just pulled their arm free. She told herself it was drafts, settling, her own tired mind. when a ceiling tile in the security office drifted just enough to let dust fall onto her coffee, and she saw, above it, that someone had scrawled in marker on the hidden side of the tile. "You're late, 3:47. She tried to laugh and texted a photo to her younger brother with, "Tell me again why I took this job," underneath. But the sick twist in her gut didn't fade. On the third Thursday of October 2019, she clocked in at 10:54 p.m. hungry and wired, having come straight from a double shift at the grocery store that still hadn't given her the raise she was promised. The weight of 2 red final utility bills folded in her bag. Eileen caught her at the coffee machine, glanced at the schedule, and frowned. "They've still got you on East alone?" the nurse asked, softer now. "Ask for rotation at least. People burn out fast up there." Maya joked that she was too broke to burn out, and Eileen just squeezed her arm and said, "Just don't ignore it if something feels wrong, okay? Buildings hold on to things. That one holds on harder." Then midnight rolled over, and everyone with a key card to a live part of the hospital went home or hunkered down, leaving Maya as one of only 4 people on site, the other 3 on the opposite side of the complex. At 11:30, she did her first sweep, noting with relief that nothing looked out of place. No broken boards, no forced doors, no kids with flashlights, and shaky courage. She lingered a little longer than usual at the doorway of Ward 7, looking down the long hallway into the dimness, then told herself she was being melodramatic and turned away. By 1:15 a.m., she was in the East Wing security office, a repurposed storage closet with a desk, a space heater that she'd been warned 30 times not to use because of the fire code, and 8 ancient monitors stacked in 2 rows, each marked with yellowing label tape: Stair 1, W7 exit, W7 hall, roof, and so on. She stirred powdered creamer into lukewarm coffee with a plastic stirrer and settled in for what she expected to be another long, uneventful stint of watching nothing happen. That was when she noticed the pattern. Monitor 4, labeled W7 hall, showed the corridor outside the Ward 7 rooms in washed-out gray. Doors with their little windows, scorched patches on the floor where the fire had been worst. A lonely plastic chair someone had left by 2:29. Every 3 minutes exactly, the picture tore into a storm of static for 7 seconds, then snapped back crystal clear. She checked the clock on the wall, then her watch, then the digital timestamp on the screen, counting under her breath as the image went to snow. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. At 7, the hallway reappeared unchanged. Except she could swear the door to room 237 was open slightly wider than it had been in the previous clear frame. She grabbed the remote, rewound the last 2 cycles, and played them back slowly. In the first, the door sat with a gap as wide as her thumb. In the second, the gap was the width of 2 fingers. In the third, 3. The math was simple. Something was pushing that door wider each time the camera glitched. Her training said write it up as a possible electrical fault and call maintenance in the morning. Her curiosity and something colder made her lean closer. In the static, if she let her eyes go unfocused, there was a darker shape where the doorframe should be. An absence in the noise shaped roughly like a person standing dead still. The coffee in her stomach turned to acid. Before she could decide whether to go up and physically check the door or call it into the main security office, the radio on her belt crackled once. Not with channel chatter from the other guards on the far wing, but with a sharp burst of her own voice. "Check room 237 now," it said, clear as if she were speaking into her own ear. "She's still breathing, but not for much longer." The call sign flashing on the radio's tiny orange screen was her badge number. Her hand wasn't anywhere near the push-to-talk button. She stared at it for a full 5 seconds, waiting for someone on the main channel to laugh and say, "Got you." But the radio fell silent again, leaving the soft hiss of open air. Protocol won the argument. She logged the time, grabbed the maglite and the jingling ring of master keys and headed for the stairwell, telling herself someone else must be on the channel playing tricks. Maybe one of the day shift guys with access to a voice changer app. As she climbed, every fluorescent tube in the stairwell gave off a different leg of hum, the tones overlapping in a way that made her teeth itch, like flies buzzing on the wrong frequency. When she pushed open the heavy fire door to Ward 7, the air that hit her smelled faintly of burned plastic under the mildew, a scent that hadn't been that strong earlier in the night. Her breath fogged in front of her as if she'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. The hallway stretched away in front of her, long and straight. The exit sign's red glow, a distant promise at the far end. Her flashlight sliced through the dimness, catching numbers over the doors: 229, 231, 233. Room 237 sat near the middle of the run, its door just barely ajar. She stepped closer and felt, before she saw, that the floor in front of it was tacky under her boots. When she angled the beam down, she saw a trail of dark, faintly glistening marks leading from the center of the hall into the room. Boot prints. Same tread pattern as hers, same size. A left-right rhythm that matched her gait almost perfectly. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She pulled her phone from her pocket with her free hand, snapped a blurry picture she wasn't sure would capture anything, then forced herself to nudge the door wider with her toe. The room inside looked like the husk of something that had once been alive. No mattress on the bed, just a corroded frame bolted to the wall. The metal ring in the floor where restraints had snapped taut for years. The window an opaque smear of grime and soot from the old fire. Her beam crawled over the walls and stopped on words written above the bed at shoulder height. "You already stayed too long," the letters forming out of a clammy, translucent film. As she watched, a droplet formed on the tip of the G, fattened, and slid down slowly, leaving a wet track. Her skin prickled. On the bed frame sat a neatly folded hospital gown, the institutional blue-green almost bright against all the gray, and perched on top of it was a plastic security badge clipped to a blue lanyard, the same shade as the one hanging from her belt. She didn't need to pick it up to know it bore her picture and name, but she did anyway, because denial is stubborn. The badge in her hand matched the one on her hip exactly, down to a tiny swirl in the background printing and a faint crack along the lower edge. For a dizzy second, both felt real and solid. Then her stomach lurched and she dropped the twin back onto the gown. She backed out of the room without turning around, kept the flashlight trained on the interior until she crossed the threshold, then turned and walked as quickly as she could back to the stairwell, not letting herself look into any of the other windows as she passed. In the office, monitor 4 was still feeding the Ward 7 hallway. Now, though, the camera showed a figure at the far end of the corridor, framed from behind. Same dark ponytail, same slightly hunched shoulders, same jacket with its fraying left cuff. Her breath hitched. As she watched, the figure in the screen slowly turned toward the camera, revealing her own face, lit harshly from overhead but unmistakable. The other Maya raised a hand and pressed her palm flat toward the lens. Her lips moved, and though the old system carried no audio, Maya could read them. "Don't go back." The digital time code at the bottom of the screen rolled from 034712 to 034713, 034714, then froze at 034715. The wall clock behind her office chair ticked once, and stopped. Somewhere in the ceiling, the steady mechanical whine of the air handler cut out, leaving the kind of silence where your own heartbeat sounded indecently loud. The next sound was metal, a series of distant muffled clunks echoing through the concrete as if heavy locks all over the building were sliding into place. She bolted for the stairs, the bad coffee sloshing in her empty stomach, her boots loud on the steps. When she shoved the Ward 7 door open again, the hallway felt transformed, every flat surface slightly wrong, as if viewed through warped glass. Every patient room door that had been open even an inch was now closed so tightly she could see the frames vibrating from the force. She jogged toward room 237 and found its door shut as well, handle chill beneath her fingers. From inside, a sound of movement, of someone shifting their weight, then a series of soft thumps against the door as if someone was hitting it with the heels of their hands. "Please," her own voice cried from the other side, ragged and hoarse. "Please, I don't know how long I've been here. The clock won't move. She said she'd use my face so someone would let her out. Maya, please, I'm in here. I'm you." The words sank needle deep. Her fingers tightened on the keys. Some deep, stupid human part of her wanted to open that door because the sound of another person, another her, begging for help was too much. Before she could give in, the rest of the hallway erupted. Starting from the farthest door, each room slammed shut in turn with a deafening boom that she felt through her feet, the rhythm rushing toward her like a physical thing. She flinched as the door right beside her, 236, blew inward an inch and then crashed back, its little safety glass window exploding outward in a shower of tiny cubes that pattered against her arms and face. The exit door's bar at the end of the hall rattled once and then locked with an audible thunk. Panic finally overcame protocol. She turned and ran for the staff bathroom halfway back down the corridor, the world tunneling down to the stretch of linoleum before her. She slammed herself inside, shoved a dented metal trash can under the handle until it jammed, and backed away until her spine hit the sink. The fluorescent tube overhead flickered epileptically, painting the dingy room in violent alternations of light and shadow. In one flash, she saw herself in the cracked mirror, wide-eyed, hair sticking to her forehead with sweat. In the next, the mirror showed the same room but empty. The door behind her open on a hallway that wasn't Ward 7 at all, but something deeper, darker. The light steadied and both images were gone, leaving only her own gasping reflection. On the broken toilet tank behind her lay a black hardback notebook she was certain hadn't been there earlier. The cover bore the imprint Security, Ward 7, its silver ink dulled by time. Anything was better than staring at the door waiting for the handle to turn, so she grabbed it, flipped it open, and scanned the first lines. The early pages were mundane. Notes about light bulbs, clogged drains, a drunk cousin of a patient trying to sneak in after visiting hours. The handwriting changed around the middle sharp block letters that grew more frantic as the dates advanced to October 2004. The name beneath each entry was the same, M. Webb. Marcus wrote about the night of the fire, alarms blaring, smoke crawling along the ceiling of Ward 7 like a living thing, staff hustling patients toward the stairs as flames leapt between tiles above. After that, he wrote about the after, the wing sealed, the smell of burned wiring that never quite left, the way motion sensors went off in empty hallways, the way his radio occasionally echoed his own words back to him 5 seconds late. Then he wrote about a night that made Maya's skin crawl because the pattern was too familiar. Arrow 347. Clock stuck. Cam 4 stuck. I'm on the screen twice. I'm here and I'm out there. Voices on the radio using my ID telling me to check 237 door opening by itself in the playback. There's 2 of me and only one of us gets to leave. The final entry was shorter, ink smudged as if written with shaking hands. If you're reading this, you stayed long enough for her to notice you. She needs new faces. She likes pairs. The one outside, the one inside. She'll use your voice to bring in the next one. Don't answer when you hear yourself. Don't trust mirrors at 347. As she finished the last line, the bathroom light snapped off with a loud pop that left an after-image seared into her vision. Darkness dropped, thick and total. For a second, she thought the bulb had burned out, but then a faint strip of green seeped in under the door from the exit sign in the hallway. Enough to trace the silhouette of the trash can's legs and the thin gap under the door. In that floating band of light, another shadow slid into view. It was wrong even in outline. Too tall by a head, shoulders slightly skewed, the angle of the neck bent a few degrees past natural. It stopped inches from the door. The handle jiggled once, then turned slowly until it pressed against the trash can and went no further. Maya held her breath so hard her lungs ached. On the other side, her own voice spoke in a muffled near whisper. "Okay," it said almost kindly. "You got further than I did. But you can't stay in there forever." The shadow leaned closer, thickening. "She doesn't like to be kept waiting." The way the last word almost doubled on itself, overlapping, made her think of two mouths speaking at slightly different times. The urge to answer, to say anything, gnawed at her. She clamped both hands over her mouth and pressed the back of her head harder into the cool tile. At some point, her body did what bodies do when terror runs too long. It simply shut down for a while. When she jerked awake, the fluorescent light was burning steadily overhead again, buzzing its tired insect drone. Her legs were pins and needles from where she'd curled up on the floor. The shadow under the door was gone. She listened for a full minute, ears straining. The only sounds were the distant thrum of machinery from the hospital's live wings and an occasional drip she couldn't place. Her watch, which she was sure had frozen at 3:47 along with the wall clock, now ticked calmly along and read 5:51 a.m. Her phone vibrated weakly in her pocket when she hit the button, leaping straight to the lock screen as if no time had passed at all. 3 missed calls from an unknown number were time-stamped 3:47 a.m., no voicemails. Heart hammering against her ribs, she eased the trash can away from the door and cracked it open. The hallway outside looked like it did during daytime rounds. Too long, too empty. Doors gaping at lazy angles. Dust floating in shafts of gray light from the one unboarded window by the stairwell. She walked. She didn't look at room 237. She didn't look at any of the little rectangular windows. On the second floor, the air warmed slightly. By the time she hit the ground level and pushed out through the service exit into thin, chilly morning air, birds were just beginning to test their voices in the trees beyond the parking lot. No one stopped her. No one asked why her shift wasn't over for another hour. She drove home on autopilot, showered until the hot water ran out, then sat on her bed with the radio from the hospital on the comforter in front of her, watching it. It stayed stubbornly silent. By noon, she'd written a brittle resignation email full of phrases like "personal reasons" and "effective immediately," and hit send, then blocked the hospital's number. She threw her badge and uniform into a black trash bag and hauled it down to the dumpster. For 3 nights, she slept with all the lights on and every mirror in her apartment draped with towels. For a while, it almost felt like she'd outrun it. On November 5th, she came home from the grocery store to find a small padded envelope sitting alone in the middle of her welcome mat. No carrier logo, no sender information beyond her own name, neatly printed, and her address. The postmark caught her eye first. Westfield State Hospital Mailroom, OCT 14, 2004. 14 years before she'd even applied there. Her fingers went slick when she tore it open. Inside was a single glossy photo and a plastic ID card. The photo was a still from a security camera. She knew the angle too well. Ward 7's hallway shot from the perspective of Monitor 4, the door to room 237 perfectly framed. 2 figures stood in front of it. Both were Maya. One faced the camera, hand pressed flat as if against glass, mouth open mid-warning. The other had her back half-turned, head tilted toward the door, shoulders tense like she was listening. The timestamp in the corner read 03:47:15, 11/5/19, today's date. The plastic ID card bore her photo and name, but the issue date field read 10/01/2004 and her job title line said Night Guard, Ward 7. There was a worn groove along the bottom edge, as if someone had worried it between their fingers for years. That night, she triple-latched her door, piled a kitchen chair under the knob for good measure, and still woke up abruptly to darkness and the awareness that she was already standing. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:47 a.m. in watery green. Her bare feet were cold on the tile of the bathroom. Her hand was outstretched toward the mirror as if she'd been about to knock on her own reflection. For a heartbeat, the image in the glass didn't quite sync with her motion. Her hand in the mirror stayed up a fraction of a second longer than the real one, eyes just slightly off, lips moving a fraction behind. Behind her reflected shoulder, the doorway didn't open onto her small, messy hallway, but onto a longer corridor lined with heavy institutional doors and a single red exit sign far away. At the end of that wrong hallway, a door with 237 stenciled above it was opening very slowly, darkness spilling out like water. She blinked hard, and the ordinary apartment bathroom snapped back, peeling paint, shower curtain with fading blue stripes, no endless hallway. But the clock still read 3:47, and when it finally rolled to 3:48, she felt something inside her unclench a fraction and then tighten even worse, because she understood what Marcus had meant. 3:47 was less a time and more a place. A narrow corridor where the version of her that got away and the one that didn't could see each other. In the weeks that followed, the hospital followed her. Grainy, inexplicable echoes of Ward 7 crept into her life. A bus security camera caught a reflection of her asleep in her seat while someone with her silhouette stood in the aisle 2 rows back, watching. A friend sent her a drunk video from a bar, and in the mirrors behind the bottles for 3 frames, the shelves were replaced by a long hospital hallway, her figure small in the distance. She started waking up in different rooms at 3:47 a.m., standing, always facing some reflective surface, window, TV screen, the black glass of her phone, with her hand lifted like she was trying to feel for a thin barrier. Once during a thunderstorm, lightning flashed and turned her living room window into a mirror. For a moment, she saw not her own apartment behind her, but the Ward 7 bathroom with the trash can braced under the handle and a shadow leaning against the other side of the door. She covered every mirror in the apartment after that, but the TV still went dark when she turned it off, and the blue LED of the cable box read 3:47 more often than statistics should have allowed when she glanced at it. She tried to talk herself out of it. She got a therapist, left out the supernatural, talked only about work stress and a bad experience. The therapist told her about trauma loops, about the mind returning to the point of impact, about the brain trying to rewrite endings. It made sense in the bright office with plants in the corner and a white noise machine hissing gently in the hall. It made less sense, too, months later when her landlord installed a cheap building-wide security system after a break-in down the street, and the first time he proudly showed her the camera feed on his phone, one of the thumbnails glitched for just a second. Where the feed from the lobby should have been, there was a view she recognized instantly. The 4th-floor East Wing hallway at Westfield, empty and gray, the door to 237 half open, and someone just for a frame standing at the far end with their hand raised. The last time she heard from Westfield directly was half a year after she quit, on a day she'd deliberately spent doing everything ordinary she could think of. Laundry, vacuuming, scrolling through social media, anything to keep her mind moving. A plain brown envelope arrived with no return address, dropped through the mail slot. Inside was a photocopy of a page from an internal incident report, the header smudged but legible. Security log, East Wing, 0347 incident. The date at the top was blurred, but the year was clearly 2025, some point still ahead of her. The narrative described a trainee guard sent alone to cover the East Wing overnight, cameras freezing at 3:47, monitor 4 showing duplicate subject, radio traffic looping. In the margin, someone had handwritten a note in tight, familiar letters. If you see this before it happens, you might not have to go back. Underline might. It was signed, simply, Monsieur Torres. The page number in the corner said 37, implying 6 others she hadn't received. Her head swam. Somewhere, some version of her had stayed with the hospital long enough to be the one writing incident reports. Somewhere, some version of her had gone back. After that, she stopped telling herself she'd escaped. You don't escape a loop. You just find yourself at a different point on it. She began to mark 3:47 a.m. and 3:47 p.m. as hazards, moments to be somewhere intentionally bright and noisy, somewhere with no reflective surfaces nearby. It didn't always help. Once, in a crowded grocery store, her phone camera opened in her hand without her touching it and showed, instead of the cereal aisle in front of her, a live feed of Ward 7's hallway. Door 237 closed. Someone breathing raggedly just off camera. Once, riding in a friend's car at night, the windshield reflected the dashboard lights, and for 3 heartbeats the faint outline of a long, narrow corridor instead of the rain-slick road ahead. Her friend chatted about something inconsequential, oblivious, while Maya watched the ghost corridor in the glass recede like a tunnel they were driving away from or straight into. By the time she moved states away, changed her name, and took a job in a building with no basements at all, she had accepted that whatever Ward 7 was, haunted architecture, a rip in time, a hungry echo, it had chosen her as one of its markers. Her role was simple and terrible: to stand in that hallway, in one version of reality or another, at 3:47, and be the familiar face that made the next guard hesitate at the door. She knew, in the place you know things from nightmares, that somewhere in the concrete bones of Westfield, a monitor would always, at some point in the night, freeze on her image, hand pressed to the glass, mouth forming silent warnings. And she knew that one night, despite all the versions of her who had run and refused and looked away, there would be one Maya who turned the key in room 237's lock anyway, who chose to answer her own voice on the other side, and in that moment the loop would skip, and whichever Maya won that coin toss would be the one left pounding on steel while the other walked away. Convinced she'd gotten out, right up until the clock at home stopped at 3:47 again and the hallway in the mirror opened like a mouth waiting. Story 2. The Marking. Derek Vaughn was hanging 280 feet underground when he saw his own initials carved into the cave wall at eye level, DV, followed by that day's date, 08-14-21, and in the harsh white circle of his headlamp, the letters looked freshly gouged, edges still crumbling chalk dust, even though he had never been in this part of Hellhole Cave before, and according to every map and every old-timer he'd talked to, no one else had either. But what happened next changed everything. The rope above him creaked against unseen rock as fine white fibers peeled off and drifted down past his face like slow snow. Each tiny break a reminder that his lifeline was sawing itself apart on some invisible lip, and 10 years of caving experience told him he didn't have long before it snapped clean through and dropped him into whatever waited below. Hellhole had been his obsession since his early 20s, a sprawling West Virginia cave system with miles of tight passages and big rooms. A place people whispered about in the grotto meetings when they were tired of talking about safe, well-mapped tourist holes. There were stories about strange drafts on windless days, about voices in empty passages, but most of all there was the legend of 1976 when 2 experienced cavers, Min Chen and Rebecca Soto, had radioed about finding a new way down, something huge and unmapped, then gone silent forever. Official reports talked about equipment failure and a tragic fall. Unofficially, older cavers lowered their voices when they said the word Hellhole, like the cave was listening and you didn't want to remind it you existed. Derek had always rolled his eyes at that part because caves weren't hungry and rocks didn't remember people. They just fell, shifted, and waited. But hanging there with his own initials staring back at him from stone that should have been untouched, He felt, for the first time, like maybe places could notice you. He had fought to get here. Months of paperwork with the local cave conservancy, safety plans, environmental impact notes, all the bureaucratic hoops you had to jump through if you wanted to drop a restricted shaft in 2021 without getting blacklisted. On the surface that morning, under a low sky that promised rain by afternoon, he'd loaded gear next to his two friends and occasional caving partners, Jared and Kim, while they sipped gas station coffee and tried to act like this was just another weekend drop. "You sure about this one?" Kim had asked, glancing toward the tree line where the cave mouth yawned unseen. "You've been talking about Shaft 7 like a lottery ticket since I met you." He'd laughed, slung a coil of rope over his shoulder and said, "Exactly. Today we find out if it's a jackpot or a dud." He hadn't mentioned the way reading old newspaper clippings about Min and Rebecca made something in his chest ache. The quote from a brother who'd said Rebecca liked to find the places maps were scared of. The blurry photograph of Min at a grotto picnic squinting into the sun. It was easy to romanticize people who disappeared underground. They didn't get older, didn't sell their gear, didn't tell stories about their knees going bad. They stayed at the edge of something forever. Derek, 36, with a thinning bank account and a job designing foundations for other people's buildings, felt that edge pulling at him harder every year. Shaft 7 was his chance to stand where they had stood and go one step farther. But not too far, he'd promised himself. Always conservative, always with a margin. The descent had started clean. At 9:17 a.m., he'd clipped onto the main line they'd rigged to a thick, healthy tree a safe distance from the lip. Double-checked every carabiner, triple-checked his descender, and swung his legs over into the shadow. The temperature dropped with every meter. The green of the forest narrowed to a ragged circle of sky. The first 100 feet went smoothly, the shaft walls close enough for him to brace a boot here and there to control spin. His voice drifted up as cheerful updates. 50 feet, all good, 100. Rock quality's solid, seeing some nice flowstone at 120. Jared's jokes floated down in return, thin and slightly distorted. If you see any lost skeletons, ask if they signed the waiver. At about 150, though, he'd felt the first odd thing, a sudden breath of air from below that smelled colder than the rest of the shaft, with a faint tang not of bat guano or damp earth, but of something older, like water that had been trapped for a very long time. His headlamp picked up faint horizontal lines in the rock, natural bedding planes in the limestone, nothing unusual there, but his ears caught another sound under the squeak of his descender. A faint, rhythmic scratching that rose and fell on no breeze he could feel. He told himself it was water drip echo, the exaggerated acoustics of a vertical space, anything but deliberate movement. You didn't want to start attributing intention to noises underground. That way lay panic. Still, as he dropped past 200 feet, the scratching had settled into a pattern. 3 quick scrapes, a pause, 3 more, as if someone were dragging something sharp across stone at regular intervals. He'd radioed up, tried to keep his tone casual. "Hearing some weird acoustics down here, just FYI, probably nothing." Jared had answered with a distracted copy, more focused on the rigging than Derek's nerves, and Kim had cut in to say, "If you start hearing banjo music, we're pulling you out." That had made him laugh for real and shake off some of the creeping unease. Then, 20 or 30 feet later, his rope had started that sickening little song against the wall, tiny fibers breaking, and he'd swung his light to see where it was rubbing. That was when his Gudun beam had passed over the carving. DV 81421. Clean, deep letters cut into the gray stone, about 6 inches tall, centered perfectly at his current height, as if waiting for his gaze. It was so exactly his style of block lettering that for a disorienting moment he thought, "Did I do this? Did I drop here before and forget? Maybe a different shaft? Maybe a dream that felt too real?" The thought made no sense. He kept detailed logbooks of every cave trip he'd ever taken, and Shaft 7 had been off limits until today. The date on the wall was today. Below the initials, shallow but legible, were 3 more words. Don't come back. He just stared, sweating into the foam of his helmet. Somewhere behind his sternum, a smaller, quieter version of himself said very calmly, "This is what it feels like to arrive somewhere you haven't reached yet." Above him, the rope strained again. There was no time to sit and unravel paradoxes. He'd done 100 descents in his life, some hairy, some postcard perfect, and the thing that had kept him alive through all of them was the discipline to move even when his brain wanted to freeze. So he made himself decide. Down to the bottom now, as controlled as possible, then off this dying line and onto a backup before it cut through completely. He shouted up that the rope was compromised, that he was nearly at the floor and would rig from below. Heard the thin, tinny voices of his partners crackle back. "Okay, just keep talking, man, we've got you on the device," and forced his shaking hands to feed the rope through his descender. The last 20 feet were the longest of his life. Not because of the distance, but because every sound, the scrape of rope, the whisper of his own breath, was accompanied by that scratching from below getting louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making it heard him coming and couldn't contain its excitement. His boots hit bottom abruptly, knees bending to absorb the impact, and at almost the same instant the tension disappeared from the rope above as the frayed section finally gave way with a soft, anticlimactic sigh. The free ends slithered down past his helmet and thumped onto the stone beside him. Individual strands splayed like severed nerves. For a second he just stood there, hands still on the now useless descender, and let the fact sink in. If he'd hesitated even a little longer, if he'd spent another 30 seconds arguing with himself, he would have taken a 30-foot fall onto who knew what. "I'm down," he said into the radio, voice sounding distant in his own ears. "Main failed, but I'm on solid, I'm fine." Static answered him, then Kim's voice a notch too high. "You cut out for a sec, are you hurt?" He looked at his hands. No blood. His shoulder twinged where the harness had dug in, but nothing felt broken. "I'm okay," he repeated, and as he said it, the scratching stopped. The silence that crashed in after it felt almost physical, a heavy pressure in his ears. He swept his light around to get his bearings. The chamber at the bottom of Shaft 7 was narrower than he'd hoped, more chimney than ballroom, its walls slick with condensation that beaded and ran in slow, fat drops. The shaft continued down on one side, narrower still, a dark throat plunging into an even deeper unknown. On a ledge about 3 feet below the lip of that continuation, something orange was jammed into a crack. It took him a moment to recognize the shape. A corner of a pack, the old-style canvas kind from the 70s, now stiff and crusted with calcite. Every story he'd ever heard about Hellhole's missing pair snapped into a sharper focus. "I see gear," he said. "Looks older. Might be theirs." He didn't add that the air coming up from the lower tube felt wrong, like cold breath on the back of his neck. He rigged a quick temporary anchor a few feet above the pack with a spare bolt and his backup rope, fingers clumsy but automatic, muscle memory taking over. Then he edged down just enough to reach the orange canvas, wedging his boots into tiny irregularities in the rock, and worked it free. Rock dust and something darker, too fine to be dirt, too granular to be mold, fell out as he pulled it loose. He didn't think about what that something might be. Back up on the slightly wider bit of floor, he set the pack down and unzipped it. The metal teeth fought him, fused by time and minerals, but finally gave. Inside, things shifted with a muffled clink. A flashlight the size of his forearm, its rubber cracked, a metal tin, a coil of thin rope stiffened into its shape, and tucked in a plastic bag that had gone cloudy with age, a small notebook. On the pack's inner flap, bleeding through the canvas in faded black marker, he could just make out a name, M. Chen 876. His hands went colder than the cave air. "I've got it," he whispered to no one in particular. He slid the notebook out of its bag, careful not to tear the water-softened paper. The early entries were exactly what he expected from a caver's log in the 70s. Weather, surface conditions, sketches of formations with enthusiastic arrows and notes like incredible drapery, little jokes about Rebecca's snoring. A few pages in, the tone shifted. "Found vertical shaft today," one entry said in tight, eager script. "Deeper than any drop on map. Air from below very cold. Are not sure it's safe. I think it's what we came for." Later, "Scratching again. Not mice. Patterned. R swears she heard someone call her name. No one below? We joked about cave ghosts. Don't feel like joking now." Derek's own breath sounded too loud as he turned the pages. "Names in stone," Min had written. Dozens, maybe more. Some with dates from the future. 1989, 2002, 2019. R says we're freaking ourselves out seeing what we expect. But I touched one. Felt like the rock was pulsing. Under my hand. Not like anything I've felt. The last entry was a handful of words, ink darker like the pen had been pressed harder. Heard my own voice calling from down there, telling me to come see. Knows things I've never said aloud. Going down a little farther. If someone reads this before we're back, don't answer when you hear yourself. The line cut off mid-stroke. There were no more pages written on. He closed the notebook with more force than necessary, heart hammering. "Get out," it said without saying the words. "Leave now." He glanced at the wall again, meaning only to orient himself to where his fresh anchor was in relation to the main shaft, and saw the handprints. He'd mistaken them for mineral stains before, irregular shapes where calcite had run and dried. But now that he was looking properly, their pattern sprang into focus. 5-fingered impressions arranged in rough spirals, palms about the size of his own, some bigger, some child small, all pressed into the stone as if the rock had been soft clay at the moment of contact. They weren't stains, they were hollows, each one cupping a small pool of moisture that glistened in his beam. They followed the curve of the shaft, pointing down with a unanimity that made his neck hair stand up. He reached out, compelled against every screaming instinct, and laid his fingertips in one of the prints. The stone was cool, but there was a tremor there, a faint vibration like something moving on the other side of a very thick, very old door. He snatched his hand back, heart in his throat. "Status?" Jared's voice crackled in his ear, distorted slightly as if traveling a longer distance than the few 100 feet between them. "You went quiet, man." Derek swallowed around a suddenly dry mouth. "Found Chen's pack," he said slowly. "There's a way down. I'm not taking it. I'm rigging an ascent now and coming up. We're done with this one." As he spoke, another voice cut across the channel in perfect sync with his own, layered just enough out of phase that his brain tripped over the sound. It was his voice, or close enough to fool anyone who didn't share his head, saying, "I'm going down to check it out. You should see this. It's incredible." For a horrifying half-second, he thought he had actually said both, that his mouth had split its duties without his consent, but Jared's reply shattered that idea. "The hell are you talking about?" Jared snapped. "You just said you're coming up. Don't screw with us like that." Kim chimed in, more worried than angry. "Derek, pick one, please." He shut his eyes, willed his hands to stop shaking long enough to tie a clean figure 8 and clip his ascender onto the fresher line he'd anchored. "Ignore anything that sounds like me but isn't me," he told them, hoping they wouldn't ask for clarification. "If I say I'm going down again, assume I'm lying. I'm coming up." Somewhere below, the scratching started again, louder now, like someone was carving more words into the walls at high speed. His headlamp flickered once, twice. twice, though the battery indicator was fine when he checked it with fumbling thumb. He didn't look down. He set his foot in the ascender loop, stood, slid it up, repeated. The first few feet were clumsy. His legs felt like they were made of water, his injured shoulder protesting every upward thrust. The voices followed him. At first they were jumbled, a crowd of whispers all trying to occupy the same space, but gradually they sorted into something intelligible. His mother's voice from when he was small and had woken from a nightmare about falling, soothing and half asleep. "It's just a dream, baby, you're safe." Min Chen's voice, as he imagined it from the tight script in the notebook, brisk and curious. "You want to know, don't you? We did too, it doesn't stop." His own voice, but older somehow, rougher, saying, "This isn't the first time you've climbed out. You're getting better at it, but you never stay away." Upward progress measured itself out in tiny victories. A bolt head he remembered passing on the way down, a peculiar notch in the rock at what he guessed was 230, a change in the quality of the air as it went from cave still to faintly moving. Every now and then his boot slipped and something cold brushed his ankle, like fingers that couldn't quite close. At one point the ascender jammed when grit caught in its teeth. As he fumbled with it, a whisper rose from directly below his feet, close enough that he could feel the breath of it on the sole of his boot. "Just let go," it suggested in his own voice, shaded with a tired amusement he didn't feel. "It's shorter that way." He almost laughed then, on the edge of hysterical, because of course it was shorter. Gravity was always the faster route. He gritted his teeth, knocked the device against the rock until the grit spat out and kept climbing. When the shaft mouth finally appeared again above him as a jagged circle of pale morning, he could taste fresh air in a way he never had before, like cold water after days of thirst. Jared's and Kim's helmets bobbed into view, their faces pale and strained, eyes wide as they peered down. "We've got you at 20 feet, Kim called, voice cracking. "Keep coming, you're good, you're good." Their hands reached for him the last 2 body lengths, grabbing harness and forearms, hauling him up until he sprawled on his back on the forest floor. The solid, uneven reality of roots and rocks under his spine shockingly comforting. For a while the only sounds were his breaths and the faint drip of water from the trees. Finally Jared sat back on his heels, wiped a hand over his face and said, "You were down there too long, man. We lost you on the tracker twice. I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. Kim, still breathing hard herself from the effort of hauling, said, "Your radio went weird, like you were talking over yourself. Don't do that again." Derek closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the notebook in his jacket pocket like a stone. "We're not dropping that shaft again," he said, and his voice came out flat in a way that made both of them look at him sharply. "We log what we found, seal it, warn people off. That's it." They agreed too quickly, relief obvious. They de-rigged in efficient silence, coiling ropes, checking for damage. The main line's frayed section nearer the lip was worse than he'd thought, half the outer sheath gone, inner core fibers hanging in a loose fringe. He stared at it for a moment, thinking of the way the break had coincided so perfectly with his boots hitting bottom, as if something down there had been holding the last threads together just long enough to let him land. Back at the trucks, he should have felt triumph. He'd dropped a forbidden shaft, touched history, found Chen's pack. Instead, he felt like he'd brushed fingers with something that wasn't done with him yet. In the weeks that followed, he tried to go back to normal. He went to work, answered emails, sat in meetings where people argued earnestly about load-bearing capacities and cost overruns. He went climbing at the gym, his body moving on autopilot, belaying friends who complained about chalk and calluses. He told almost no one about Hellhole beyond the barest facts. Rope abrasion, near miss. Found some old gear not worth the risk, we called it. A couple of the older cavers clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Oh, smart call. That cave eats people," in the tone of voice that said they were half joking, half not. He wanted to forget the feel of that handprint hollow under his glove, the way the rock had almost seemed to pulse, the way his own voice had come back wrong on the radio. But forgetting turned out to be harder than he'd ever imagined. It started small. He woke one night sure that someone had said his name right next to his ear. The apartment was dark, the only light the tiny red eye of his smoke detector. His alarm clock read 3:18 a.m. He listened, heart pounding, but there was only the distant hum of the building's boiler. As he lay there, the mattress under his back felt for an instant like a harness. Straps cutting into hips, a phantom ache in his thighs from climbing. When he swung his feet out of bed, the floorboards felt slightly concave under his heels, as if something beneath had pressed upward and then withdrawn. A few days later, in the shower, he noticed faint gray smudges around his ankles, 5 in a line on each side, in the shape of fingers. They washed off under hot water, leaving only a memory of pressure. Then came the writing. On his lunch break at work, he bent to plug his laptop cable into the power strip under his desk and saw shallow lines carved into the particle board, underside. For a crazy second, he thought some previous tenant had doodled there, but when he angled his phone flashlight, he saw the letters. DV100321, pay attention. He sat back so fast he knocked his chair into the wall. No one else in the shared office looked up. On the concrete pillar in the parking garage where he never parked but sometimes walked past, a patch of lighter gray curved into a familiar pattern. He told himself it was his imagination until he traced it with one fingertip and felt the faint give of lines pressed into not yet fully cured concrete years ago. On his regular climbing wall in a scuffed corner he'd never noticed before, someone, some punk, he thought at first, had written "Don't look down" in white chalk. Right under it in thinner, shakier script that only showed if he squinted. We did. We're still doing it. He stopped sleeping properly. When he did sleep, he dreamed of the shaft, but never the same way twice. In one dream, he was at the bottom again, Chen's pack at his feet, except when he opened it, there was no notebook. Only layer upon layer of photographs showing him at different ages standing in front of different cave mouths, all with the same expression, all with the same faint distortion around the edges of the frame as if the air had been bent. In another, he was halfway down, rope humming under his hands, and when he looked up, the sky was full of faces looking down instead of clouds. Copies of his own and strangers, overlapping like fish in a crowded tank. They all mouthed his name, but no sound came out. Once he dreamed he was on the surface trail, walking toward the cave with his gear jangling comfortingly at his sides, except every tree trunk he passed had his initials carved into it at shoulder height, dates running in both directions, 1976, 1998, 2034, some crossed out, some circled. In that dream, he kept going anyway. The package arrived 3 months after the drop, on a night when he'd finally let himself believe maybe the weirdness was fading. No return address, just his name in block capitals across the front. Inside, a glossy photo printed on cheap paper, edges ragged where it had been cut. Min Chen and Rebecca Soto stood at the edge of Shaft 7 smiling at the camera, helmets slightly crooked, ropes neatly coiled. He recognized the original shot from the Grotto archives, but this version was different. On the right edge of the frame, half in shadow, a third figure loomed, taller than the other two by a head, shoulders hunched in a way that made its joints look wrong. Its face a blur of motion or exposure glitch. On the rock beside Min's shoulder, a cluster of carved initials and dates crowded together. Some he knew from membership lists. Some he didn't. His eyes locked onto one line about 2/3 of the way down, DV 81421. Directly beneath it, in smaller letters as if squeezed in later, another DV 111721 came back. He dropped the photo like it had burned him, then picked it up again because part of him needed to make sure it hadn't changed while he looked away. It hadn't. The date, November 17th, sat in his near future like a pin on a map. He tried to be proactive. He told himself out loud, "I am not going back there," and made appointments specifically on that day. Coffee with Kim, a project meeting with his boss, in an attempt to anchor himself to normal commitments. He gave his car keys to Jared with the half-joking explanation that he didn't want to sleep drive to the cave. Jared laughed uneasily and pocketed them, but Derek saw the way his friend's eyes slid away. That flicker that said he wanted to believe it was all a big joke but couldn't quite. The night before the 17th, Derek wrapped a length of static rope around his own wrists and clipped them to the leg of his heavy metal bed frame with a locking carabiner, threading the key onto a shoelace and tying it around his ankle so he'd know he had to do something very deliberate to free himself. He felt ridiculous and grim and a little bit like one of his own rescue diagrams. "You can't go anywhere," he told himself. "You're not going anywhere." Eventually, exhaustion dragged him under, carabiner metal cool against his skin. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the absence of the bed beneath him. The second was the rope tension around his waist and thighs, the sensation of a harness distributing his weight. The third was the cold. Not apartment in winter cold, but underground cold, dense, unmoving, threaded with mineral damp. Above him, instead of his ceiling, a ragged circle of darkness framed by tree roots and a faint patch of clouded sky loomed. He was in the shaft again, halfway between top and bottom. His wrists were free, the rope he'd clipped himself to the bed with was nowhere to be seen. His watch, pinned tight against his arm, glowed faintly. EO 347. For a heartbeat, he convinced himself this was another dream, some elaborate stress vision, until a pebble knocked loose by his own movement bounced off his helmet and stung his cheek in a way no dream ever had. The handprints on the shaft walls were clearer than he remembered, each hollow catching the light as he spun slightly on the rope. In some, water gleamed. In others, something darker pooled in the low centers. Below, the glow rose again, not from any visible source, but as if the air itself was lit from within, growing paler the deeper it went, in defiance of every rule of light he'd ever learned. From above, he heard voices. Jared calling his name, but younger, like he had on their first cave trip together. Kim laughing nervously, his mother humming a lullaby. Min Chen's voice from nowhere he could place saying, "It's one more step. You've already taken it." He craned his neck and looked up. For a disorienting instant, he thought he saw himself at the lip, helmeted, peering down, face drawn tight with a mixture of dread and determination. That version of him opened its mouth as if to shout, but whatever words came out were lost in the chorus of whispers from below. Every survival instinct screamed at him to climb. Every line on stone he'd seen so far said he already had, and would again. He didn't remember unclipping his descender or choosing which way to move. Later, he would only remember the sickening certainty that whatever direction he chose in that moment, some version of him had already made the opposite choice 100 times over. The shaft pressed in. The voices braided together into a single phrase, repeated in different timbres, old and young, male and female, his and not his. "We remember you. We wrote your name. You will write someone else's." Somewhere in the layers of sound, another sentence surfaced, wry and almost fond in a voice that might have been his own decades from now. "You never really fall," it said. "You just keep arriving where you've already been." The official record would be simple. No missing person report filed for November 17, 2021, because Derek's co-workers thought he'd taken a mental health day. and his few remaining friends figured he needed space from caves. The Cave Conservancy's log would show that access to Hellhole's restricted section was tightened again after a vehicle was found at the trailhead with gear in the back and no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. The note in the margin reading only, "Possible trespasser, no evidence of entry." Years later, a new generation of cavers would see DV8-1421 carved on the wall of a different shaft, or on the underside of a survey marker, and shrug, assuming it was just someone marking their first big drop. They'd lower themselves on new, strong ropes into darkness and listen to the quiet and tell themselves caves were just caves. And somewhere deep under Hellhole, at the bottom of a narrow tube of stone lined with handprints pressed from the inside, a man who once believed rocks didn't remember would run his fingers over fresh gouges bearing his own initials and a second date, 11/17/21. I came back, the stone warm under his touch like a living thing, while the walls around him shifted imperceptibly to make room for one more name yet to be cut, one more voice yet to echo up to someone who hadn't reached that depth. Yet.